They don't want you to know what the ancient mystics really used to reach higher states of consciousness. For thousands of years, a sacred plant has been erased from spiritual history, dismissed as a dangerous drug, and stripped of its divine purpose. But before governments banned it, before religions condemned it, cannabis was considered holy, a direct pathway to the divine. The mystics knew something we've forgotten. They understood that certain plants weren't just medicine for the body, but gateways for the soul. In hidden texts, forgotten rituals, and sacred ceremonies, cannabis played a central role in humanity's most important spiritual discoveries. These weren't addicts or criminals. They were priests, prophets, and enlightened beings who used this plant to commune with forces beyond the physical world. Today, as cannabis slowly returns to mainstream acceptance, we're beginning to remember what was always true. Some of history's most sacred traditions were built around this plant. The question isn't whether ancient mystics used cannabis, it's why this knowledge was hidden from us for so long. In the mountains of India, where the Ganges begins its sacred flow, cannabis has been revered for over 4,000 years. The Vedas, Hinduism's oldest texts, describe cannabis as one of 5 sacred plants, calling it a source of happiness and a liberator. But this wasn't recreational use, it was deeply spiritual, woven into the very fabric of divine connection. The ancient rishis, or seers, who composed the Vedas, didn't stumble upon enlightenment through meditation alone. They used cannabis to open their consciousness, to receive the cosmic downloads that became the foundation of Hindu philosophy. In the Atharva Veda, cannabis is called Vijaya, meaning victorious, because it grants victory over one's lower nature. Lord Shiva, one of Hinduism's most important deities, is forever linked with cannabis. Known as the Lord of Bhang, Shiva is said to have discovered the plant's power while meditating in the Himalayas. According to legend, after consuming cannabis, Shiva danced the cosmic dance that maintains the universe's balance. This wasn't just mythology, it was teaching about cannabis as a tool for cosmic consciousness. Even today, millions of sadhus, or holy men, smoke cannabis as part of their spiritual practice. They're not getting high for pleasure, they're following an ancient tradition that sees cannabis as a direct connection to Shiva's consciousness. During festivals like Holi and Shivratri, consuming bhang, a cannabis drink, is considered an act of worship, a way to experience divine unity. The Tantras, esoteric Hindu texts, describe specific rituals using cannabis to achieve samadhi, the highest state of meditation where individual consciousness merges with universal consciousness. These weren't casual experiments, but carefully preserved techniques passed down through generations of mystics who understood cannabis as a sacred technology for consciousness expansion. The Sanskrit word for cannabis, bhang, appears in ancient texts as early as 2000 BCE, described as one of the divine nectars that grant freedom from anxiety and bring joy. Hindu priests would prepare bhang in elaborate ceremonies, mixing the plant with milk, spices, and honey to create a sacred drink that opened the doors of perception. Ancient Indian medical texts like the Sushruta Samhita and Karaka Samhita documented cannabis as a powerful medicine for both body and spirit. They understood that this plant could heal physical ailments while simultaneously elevating consciousness to divine frequencies. The medical sages weren't just treating symptoms, they were treating the whole being. These texts describe specific dosages, preparation methods, and ceremonial protocols that ensured cannabis was used safely and effectively. The ancient Indians understood what modern science is rediscovering, that cannabis affects different people differently, and that proper preparation and mindset are crucial for beneficial experiences. The bhang preparation ceremonies were elaborate rituals involving specific mantras, planetary alignments, and sacred geometry. The priests understood that cannabis wasn't just a plant, it was a living entity with its own consciousness, deserving of respect and proper invocation before consumption. Christianity has spent centuries condemning cannabis, but the evidence suggests Jesus and his followers may have used it regularly. The original Hebrew texts of the Bible contain references to cannabis, a sacred anointing oil that modern scholars increasingly believe contained cannabis. Dr. Sula Benet, a Polish anthropologist, made a startling discovery in the 1930s. She found that the word cannabis, translated as sweet calamus in most Bibles, was actually cannabis. The recipe given in Exodus 30:23 for holy anointing oil includes this plant alongside myrrh, cinnamon, and olive oil. This oil wasn't just used to anoint objects, it was used to anoint priests, prophets, and kings. When the Bible describes someone being anointed, it often means they were literally covered in this cannabis-infused oil. The word Christ itself means anointed one. If Dr. Bennett is correct, then Jesus was quite literally anointed with cannabis oil, and his spiritual abilities may have been enhanced by this sacred plant. The Gnostic Gospels, texts excluded from the official Bible, contain even more direct references to sacred plants and their role in spiritual awakening. The Gospel of Thomas speaks of the plant that will make you know yourselves. While not explicitly naming cannabis, the description matches perfectly with what ancient mystics understood about this plant's consciousness-expanding properties. Early Christian mystics, particularly the Desert Fathers who retreated to Egypt's wilderness, may have used cannabis in their quest for divine visions. The harsh desert environment they chose was exactly where wild cannabis grows naturally. Their reports of mystical experiences, divine visions, and direct communication with angels bear striking similarities to the effects described by modern cannabis users in spiritual contexts. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites has found cannabis pollen and residue in areas designated for religious ceremonies. While mainstream Christianity eventually banned such practices, the original connection between cannabis and Christian mysticism appears to have been significant. The Coptic Christians of Egypt maintained cannabis traditions long after mainstream Christianity abandoned them. Ancient Coptic texts describe sacred smoking ceremonies where monks would inhale the breath of God to receive divine revelations and healing visions. Biblical scholars have noted that many of the healing miracles attributed to Jesus involved anointing with oils. If these oils contained cannabis, as the Hebrew suggests, then Jesus may have been using the plant's well-documented healing properties in his ministry. The early Christian church father, Clement of Alexandria, wrote about sacred plant medicines used in mystery schools, describing them as gifts from God that allowed initiates to experience divine consciousness directly. Though he never named cannabis specifically, his descriptions match the plant's effects perfectly. Long before Europeans arrived, indigenous peoples across the Americas had developed sophisticated spiritual traditions centered around sacred plants. Cannabis, though not native to the Americas, was known to shamans who understood its power to facilitate communication with the spirit world. The word shaman itself comes from the Siberian Tungus people, who used cannabis alongside other sacred plants in their healing ceremonies. These weren't primitive rituals, but highly developed technologies for consciousness that required years of training to master safely. Siberian shamans burned cannabis seeds in their ceremonies, using the smoke to enter trance states where they could travel between worlds. They understood that cannabis didn't just change their perception, it allowed their consciousness to leave their body and travel to spiritual dimensions where they could retrieve information, perform healings, and communicate with ancestors. When cannabis eventually reached the Americas through various trade routes, indigenous shamans quickly recognized its power. They incorporated it into existing plant medicine traditions, using it alongside tobacco, sage, and other sacred plants to create powerful synergistic effects. The Rastafarian movement, which emerged in Jamaica in the 1930s, represents a modern continuation of these ancient shamanic traditions. Rastafarians don't see cannabis as a drug, but as ganja, a sacred sacrament that connects them directly to divine consciousness. Their religious ceremonies center around communal cannabis use, prayer, and spiritual reflection. What modern researchers are beginning to understand is that indigenous peoples didn't use cannabis randomly. They had specific protocols, setting guidelines, and spiritual frameworks that ensured the plant was used for genuine spiritual development rather than mere intoxication. Native American traditions speak of plant spirits as teachers who can guide humans toward wisdom and healing. Cannabis was understood as one of these teacher plants, requiring proper respect, preparation, and intention before use. The shamans would fast, purify themselves, and create sacred space before communing with the plant spirit. Siberian shamanic traditions describe cannabis as the tree of life that connects earth and heaven. Shamans would climb this metaphysical tree during their cannabis-induced journeys, traveling to upper and lower worlds to retrieve lost souls, gather healing information, and commune with spiritual guides. The traditional shamanic understanding of cannabis differed dramatically from modern recreational use. Shamans saw the plant as a living being with its own wisdom and agenda. They approached it with reverence, offerings, and formal protocols that acknowledged its sacred nature. Ancient shamanic texts describe specific breathing techniques, chanting patterns, and visualization methods used in conjunction with cannabis to maximize its spiritual benefits. These techniques were designed to focus the mind and direct the plant's energy toward specific healing or visionary goals. While mainstream Islam forbids intoxicants, the mystical branch known as Sufism has a long, though carefully hidden relationship with cannabis. Sufi mystics, in their quest to experience fana, the dissolution of ego, and direct union with Allah, discovered that certain plants could facilitate these spiritual states. The great Persian poet Hafez, considered one of the greatest Sufi mystics, filled his poetry with references to wine and intoxication. But scholars now believe these weren't always references to alcohol. In the coded language of Sufi poetry, wine often referred to cannabis or other consciousness-altering substances that helped mystics achieve spiritual intoxication. Sufi orders across the Islamic world developed secret traditions around cannabis use. The Bektashi order in Turkey, the Chishti order in India, and various Sufi groups in Morocco all incorporated cannabis into their practices, though they rarely spoke of it openly due to orthodox Islamic prohibitions. These mystics understood cannabis as a tool for breaking down the ego's barriers that separate the individual from divine consciousness. They used it in conjunction with whirling meditation, chanting, and breath work to achieve states of spiritual ecstasy that they described as direct communion with Allah. The famous Sufi poet Rumi, whose works continue to inspire millions today, lived in a region where cannabis was commonly used in spiritual practices. While there's no definitive proof that Rumi himself used cannabis, his descriptions of mystical states and his emphasis on transcending ordinary consciousness mirror the experiences reported by cannabis-using mystics. Sufi texts speak of hal, temporary mystical states, and maqam, permanent spiritual stations. Cannabis was understood as a tool that could temporarily induce hal, giving the practitioner a glimpse of higher consciousness that they could then work to achieve permanently through spiritual practice. Persian Sufi manuscripts describe elaborate cannabis ceremonies conducted in secret gardens, where mystics would gather to share the sacred herb while reciting poetry and engaging in spiritual discourse. These gatherings were called assemblies of remembrance, because cannabis helped participants remember their divine nature. The Sufi understanding of cannabis was deeply theological. They saw the plant as one of Allah's gifts to humanity, a divine mercy that could temporarily lift the veils of ordinary perception and allow direct experience of divine reality. This wasn't considered sinful, but rather a form of worship. Sufi alchemists developed sophisticated theories about how cannabis affected the subtle energy centers of the body, describing how the plant opened what they called the doors of the heart and allowed divine light to flow through the practitioner's being. The mystical tradition of using cannabis in Islamic culture extended beyond the Sufis to include certain Islamic philosophers and mystics who saw the plant as a key to understanding the hidden dimensions of existence described in the Quran. So what happened? Why did this sacred plant, revered across cultures and continents, suddenly become demonized and banned? The answer lies in the intersection of politics, religion, and social control. As organized religions grew more powerful, they began to suppress any practices that gave individuals direct access to the divine. Cannabis, with its ability to induce mystical experiences without the need for priests or intermediaries, represented a threat to religious authority. If people could commune with God directly through a plant, what need did they have for religious institutions? The same pattern played out across different cultures. Christian authorities banned indigenous plant medicines in the Americas. Islamic orthodoxy suppressed Sufi practices. Colonial powers criminalized traditional shamanic ceremonies. In each case, the goal was the same: control spiritual experience by eliminating access to consciousness-expanding plants. The modern war on drugs represents the culmination of this centuries-long effort to separate humanity from its plant teachers. What began as religious suppression became political oppression, with cannabis criminalized not because of its dangers, but because of its power to free minds from conventional thinking. Recent research by institutions like Johns Hopkins University has confirmed what ancient mystics always knew. Cannabis, when used intentionally in proper settings, can facilitate genuine mystical experiences that participants describe as among the most meaningful of their lives. These experiences often lead to lasting positive changes in personality, increased empathy, and reduced anxiety and depression. The Spanish Inquisition specifically targeted indigenous peoples who used sacred plants, burning shamans alive and destroying centuries of accumulated botanical knowledge. They understood that these plant traditions represented a form of direct spiritual connection that threatened Catholic control. Colonial authorities in India similarly tried to suppress cannabis use among Hindu mystics, though they were largely unsuccessful due to the plant's deep integration into religious practice. The British eventually taxed cannabis heavily, making it less accessible to common practitioners, while allowing the wealthy to continue their spiritual practices. The 1930s prohibition of cannabis in America had clear racial and economic motivations, but it also served to disconnect people from spiritual practices that had been quietly continuing among various immigrant communities who brought their sacred plant traditions with them. Modern pharmaceutical companies have a vested interest in keeping natural plant medicines illegal, as they cannot patent naturally occurring compounds. The suppression of cannabis and other plant medicines forces people to rely on synthetic medications that generate massive profits for corporations. Today, as cannabis prohibition crumbles around the world, we're witnessing a renaissance of interest in its spiritual applications. Modern practitioners are rediscovering ancient techniques, combining traditional wisdom with contemporary understanding of consciousness and neuroscience. Researchers have found that cannabis affects the brain's default mode network, the same neural circuits that are altered during meditation, psychedelic experiences, and mystical states. This provides a scientific basis for what mystics have always known. Cannabis can temporarily dissolve the ego and allow consciousness to expand beyond its normal boundaries. Cannabis ceremonies are emerging in legal jurisdictions, often led by facilitators trained in both ancient shamanic traditions and modern harm reduction practices. These aren't recreational gatherings, but serious spiritual practices designed to help participants experience the divine connection that mystics have sought for millennia. The plant that was once central to humanity's spiritual development is returning to its rightful place. Not as an escape from reality, but as a doorway to deeper reality. Not as a recreational drug, but as a sacred medicine. Not as a threat to spiritual authority, but as a gift that connects us directly to the divine consciousness that flows through all things. Modern practitioners report experiences strikingly similar to those described in ancient texts. Feelings of unity with all existence, direct communication with divine beings, insights into the nature of reality, and lasting improvements in emotional and spiritual well-being. Scientific studies using brain imaging technology show that cannabis used during meditation dramatically increases activity in areas associated with self-transcendence and mystical experience. Participants in these studies report feelings of cosmic consciousness and unity with the universe that match descriptions found in ancient mystical texts. Modern cannabis ceremonies often incorporate elements from multiple traditions: Hindu bhang preparation techniques, Native American smudging rituals, Sufi breathing practices, and contemporary mindfulness meditation. This synthesis represents a return to the universal understanding that cannabis is a teacher plant that transcends cultural boundaries. Psychologists studying cannabis-assisted spiritual experiences have identified common themes that appear across cultures and centuries: ego dissolution, unity consciousness, encounters with divine beings or archetypal figures, profound insights into the nature of reality, and lasting positive changes in worldview and behavior. The emerging field of psychedelic therapy is beginning to recognize cannabis as a valuable tool for spiritual and psychological healing, with therapists trained in both modern psychology and ancient wisdom traditions helping clients navigate cannabis-induced mystical states. What the ancient mystics understood and what we're beginning to remember is that consciousness itself is sacred. Cannabis doesn't create spiritual experiences, it simply removes the barriers that prevent us from recognizing the divine nature of our own awareness. The mystics who used cannabis weren't seeking to escape their problems or numb their pain. They were seeking to wake up, to see through the illusions that keep us trapped in small, separate selves, to experience the unity that underlies all apparent diversity. In the Hindu tradition, this is called moksha, liberation from the cycle of suffering. In Buddhism, it's nirvana, the extinguishing of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. In Christianity, it's being born again into Christ consciousness. In Sufism, it's fana, the dissolution of the ego in divine love. Different names, same experience. And across cultures and centuries, cannabis has been one of the tools that mystics have used to access these transcendent states of consciousness. This doesn't mean cannabis is necessary for spiritual development. Many mystics achieved enlightenment without ever using any plant medicines. But for those who were called to this path, cannabis served as a powerful catalyst, accelerating their spiritual development and providing direct access to the divine consciousness that is our true nature. The mystics also understood something else that modern users often forget. Cannabis is a teacher, not an entertainer. It requires respect, intention, and proper preparation. Used carelessly, it can lead to confusion and stagnation. Used with reverence and wisdom, it can open doorways to the infinite. As we rediscover these ancient traditions, we're not just learning about history, we're reclaiming a birthright that was stolen from us.